What would you do if the person who humiliated you in public had no idea they just made the most dangerous enemy of their life? This is the story of Eleanor Wilson, a woman who looked like every grandmother you've ever known, quiet and unassuming, someone most people would glance at and immediately forget. But appearances, as you're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. When Eleanor found herself standing in a cold garage on an October night watching warm lights glow in the house, she could no longer call home. Everyone assumed she was defeated. Her own family had written her off as a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved quietly and out of sight. They had no idea that Eleanor Wilson had spent decades mastering the art of strategic warfare. They didn't know that beneath her silver hair and gentle smile was a mind that had outmaneuvered some of the most ruthless opponents in business. And they certainly didn't know that when Eleanor Wilson decided someone had gone too far, she didn't just fight back, she destroyed them completely. What happened next would prove that the most dangerous opponent is the one who's been underestimated. And tonight, you'll discover exactly what that looks like. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Eleanor Wilson's sensible shoes as she stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Maplewood Country Club. Inside, bathed in golden light from the crystal chandeliers, her daughter Jessica moved gracefully between tables of elegantly dressed guests, her navy cocktail dress catching the light as she laughed at something her husband Andrew had whispered in her ear. Eleanor pulled her wool coat tighter against the October chill. She had been standing there for 20 minutes ever since the hostess had apologetically informed her that there must have been some mistake. Her name wasn't on the guest list for the Reynolds Financial Annual Client Appreciation Dinner. "I'm Eleanor Wilson," she had said, certain there had been an error. "My daughter, Jessica Reynolds, is the host. My son-in-law, Andrew, specifically invited me this morning." The young woman had checked and double-checked her perfectly manicured finger, trailing down the tablet screen. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wilson. There's no reservation under your name, and Mr. Reynolds left very specific instructions about the guest list." Through the window now, Eleanor could see Andrew holding court at the head table, his silver hair gleaming under the lights, his tailored suit immaculate as always. At 42, he possessed the kind of polished charm that made people lean in when he spoke, the confidence that came from old Connecticut money and an Ivy League education. He was everything Thomas had never been: sophisticated, connected, comfortable in rooms filled with crystal and imported wine. As Eleanor watched, Andrew stood to address the gathering, tapping his champagne flute with a silver knife. Even through the glass, she could see his practiced smile, the way he commanded attention without effort. The guests turned toward him like flowers following the sun, and Eleanor's chest tightened with a familiar mixture of admiration and unease. "But he doesn't know," she thought, her breath fogging the cold glass, "that the woman he'd just humiliated in front of the club staff had personally negotiated the land deal that made this very building possible. He doesn't know that she'd sat across from some of the most powerful developers in New England, matching them word for word and dollar for dollar until they respected not just her husband's construction skills, but her own business acumen." Eleanor Wilson had spent 40 years building an empire from the ground up alongside Thomas, but somehow in the 5 years since his death, she'd become invisible. The grieving widow, the elderly mother-in-law, the woman who needed to be managed, guided, and apparently excluded from family events when they didn't fit the image Andrew wanted to project. She turned away from the window, fishing her car keys from her purse. The 2018 Honda Civic, practical, reliable, exactly what a widow on a fixed income should drive, sat alone under a streetlight. Not the kind of vehicle that belonged in this parking lot filled with BMWs and Mercedes, Andrew had mentioned more than once. Just another way she didn't quite fit into the life her daughter had built. The drive back to Maple Street took 12 minutes through neighborhoods she'd known since Jessica was born. Past the elementary school where she'd served on the PTA board, past the library where she'd organized fundraisers, past Green Street Cafe, where she still met Martha Daniels every Tuesday for coffee and conversation. This was her town, had been for decades, but lately it felt like she was viewing it through glass present, but somehow separate from the life flowing around her. The Colonial at 47 Maple Street glowed warmly in the darkness, its windows golden rectangles of belonging. Eleanor had designed every detail of this house with Thomas 43 years ago, when Wilson Construction was still operating out of a rented garage, and their biggest project was a 2-bedroom ranch on the other side of town. She'd drawn the floor plans herself on their kitchen table, imagining the family they'd raise within these walls, the memories they'd create in rooms built with love and ambition. The wraparound porch had been Thomas's idea. "Every house needs a place for sitting and thinking," he'd said, but the hidden reading nook under the main staircase had been hers. She'd spent countless hours there with young Jessica, reading everything from Dr. Seuss to Harry Potter, their voices blending in the cozy space Thomas had crafted with built-in bookshelves and a window seat overlooking the garden. Now the house belonged to Jessica, a gift Eleanor had insisted on 2 years ago, when Andrew had mentioned how much they loved the neighborhood, how perfect it would be for raising children. "This house should stay in the family," Eleanor had told her daughter as she signed over the deed. "Your father would want you to have the home where you grew up." She'd kept the guest suite for herself, the small apartment Thomas had built for his mother during her final years. It had its own entrance, a kitchenette, and a sitting room that looked out over the garden, where Thomas's prized roses still bloomed each spring. It was supposed to be the perfect arrangement. 3 generations under one roof, but with privacy and independence for everyone. The reality had proven more complicated. Eleanor parked in her designated spot. Andrew had been very specific about parking arrangements and walked through her private entrance. The guest suite felt smaller every day, though she knew the dimensions hadn't changed. Perhaps it was the boxes that seemed to multiply in corners, filled with belongings that no longer had a place in the main house. "Too cluttered," Jessica had explained apologetically. "Andrew thinks we should embrace a more minimalist aesthetic." She hung her coat in the narrow closet and put the kettle on for tea, her nightly ritual since Thomas died. The silence settled around her like a familiar blanket, though tonight it felt heavier than usual. Through the walls she could hear the distant sound of voices. Jessica and Andrew must have returned from the dinner. Eleanor reached for her favorite mug, the one Thomas had bought her years ago during a weekend trip to Vermont. It bore the faded inscription, "World's Best Business Partner," in gold lettering that had worn thin with use and washing. He'd presented it to her after she'd successfully negotiated their first major contract with Hartford Development, a $1 million project that had established Wilson Construction as a serious player in Connecticut's commercial market. "You made that deal happen, Ellie," Thomas had said, his eyes bright with pride and love. "I can build anything, but you can sell ice to Eskimos and make them thank you for the privilege." The memory brought both warmth and pain. Thomas had never made her feel like a subordinate or a decoration. From the very beginning, when they'd started the company with nothing but his carpentry skills and her head for numbers, he'd treated her as an equal partner. Wilson Construction's success had been their shared achievement, built on his craftsmanship and her business instincts. The kettle whistled, interrupting her thoughts. As she poured hot water over her chamomile tea bag, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the darkened window above the sink. At 70, she was still an elegant woman, her silver hair styled in a classic bob, her posture straight despite the arthritis that made cold mornings challenging. She'd maintained her figure through daily walks and careful eating, and her blue eyes, Jessica's eyes, remained sharp and alert. But when had she started looking like someone's grandmother first and Eleanor Wilson second? When had she begun introducing herself as Jessica's mother, rather than as the former CEO of Wilson Construction? The voices from the main house grew louder, and Eleanor realized Jessica and Andrew were arguing. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Tension, frustration. The kind of disagreement that happened when people were trying to keep their voices down, but emotions were running high. Eleanor had noticed these arguments increasing in frequency over the past few months. Jessica would emerge the next morning with slightly puffy eyes and a too bright smile deflecting any questions with cheerful chatter about Andrew's latest business success or their weekend plans. But Eleanor had raised Jessica from birth. She could read her daughter's moods like a familiar book. The argument ceased abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floors and doors closing. Eleanor waited a few minutes, then quietly opened her suite door and stepped into the shared mudroom. A light was still on in the kitchen and she could hear Andrew's voice, though he seemed to be on the phone. "No, absolutely not," he was saying, his tone sharp and professional. "The Winters account needs to show consistent returns. I don't care what the actual performance was, that's what the statements need to reflect." Eleanor froze. Margaret Winters was their neighbor, a widow in her 80s, who'd invested her late husband's life insurance payout with Reynolds Financial last year. Eleanor had run into her at the grocery store just last week, and Margaret had mentioned how grateful she was for Andrew's financial guidance, how well her investments were performing despite the volatile market. "Look, Henderson," Andrew continued, his voice carrying clearly through the kitchen door. "These people don't understand market fluctuations. They see their statements. They see growth. They're happy. What they don't know won't hurt them, and it keeps our management fees rolling in." Eleanor's hand tightened on the door frame. What they don't know won't hurt them. The casual dismissal in Andrew's voice, the assumption that his clients were too naive to understand their own investments, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the October night. She'd spent decades in business negotiating with contractors and developers who thought they could take advantage of a woman in a male-dominated industry. She'd learned to recognize the signs of deception, the particular arrogance that came with believing your victims were too trusting or too ignorant to catch on. "The audit's not for another 6 months," Andrew was saying. "Plenty of time to smooth things over. Just make sure the paperwork supports the narrative we've been selling." Audit, paperwork that needed to support a narrative rather than reflect reality. Eleanor's business instincts, dormant for years, but not dead, began to stir. This wasn't normal financial management. This was systematic deception. "I've got to go," Andrew said suddenly. "Jessica's asking questions about tonight, and I need to manage that situation." Eleanor retreated quickly to her suite, closing the door silently behind her. Her heart was racing, though she couldn't quite believe what she'd overheard. Andrew was successful, respected in the community. Reynolds Financial had an excellent reputation. Surely there was an innocent explanation for what sounded like client fraud. But as she sat in her small living room staring at the mug that proclaimed her the world's best business partner, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something far more serious than a family disagreement about guest lists and dinner invitations. She thought about Margaret Winters, trusting and grateful for Andrew's guidance. She thought about the other elderly clients she'd seen at various community events, proudly mentioning their association with Reynolds Financial. How many of them were seeing statements that didn't reflect reality? How many were being told comfortable lies while their actual investments performed poorly? Eleanor set down her tea and walked to the small desk where she kept her laptop, a recent purchase that Jessica had helped her select. "You need to stay connected, Mom," Jessica had insisted. "Email, social media, video calls with friends. The internet isn't just for young people anymore." Eleanor had been a quick learner, surprising herself with how easily she'd adapted to technology. Thomas had always handled their computer needs at the company, but in the years since his death, she'd discovered a facility with research and online investigation that would have made him proud. Now she opened the laptop and stared at the blank search screen. Part of her wanted to close it to pretend she hadn't heard Andrew's phone conversation to maintain the peaceful fiction that her daughter had married a good man who simply had different ideas about family dynamics. But Eleanor Wilson hadn't built a multi-million-dollar construction company by ignoring red flags or avoiding difficult truths. If Andrew Reynolds was defrauding his clients who trusted him with their life savings, then someone needed to investigate. Someone needed to protect people like Margaret Winters from smooth-talking predators who saw elderly widows as easy marks. She began typing Reynolds Financial Connecticut reviews. The first few results were positive, glowing testimonials and professional accolades. But as Eleanor dug deeper, scrolling through pages of search results with the patience of someone who'd spent years researching contractors and suppliers, she began to find subtle inconsistencies. A complaint filed with the Better Business Bureau that had been mysteriously withdrawn. A former employee's LinkedIn profile that mentioned ethical concerns as a reason for leaving Reynolds Financial. A news article about regulatory warnings in the financial services industry that mentioned firms known for aggressive marketing to elderly clients. Eleanor had always been methodical in her research, a habit that had served Wilson Construction well when evaluating potential business partners. She created a folder on her desktop and began saving articles, screenshots, and contact information. If there was something wrong at Reynolds Financial, she would find it. By 2 in the morning, Eleanor had compiled enough information to paint a troubling picture. Nothing definitive, no smoking gun or clear evidence of fraud, but a pattern of behavior that set off every alarm bell her business experience had installed. Reynolds Financial targeted elderly clients, particularly widows and widowers. The firm promised consistently high returns, regardless of market conditions. Former employees had left under unusual circumstances, often citing philosophical differences rather than specific complaints. And the few negative reviews that hadn't been mysteriously removed mentioned discrepancies between promised returns and actual account performance. Eleanor closed the laptop and prepared for bed, her mind spinning with possibilities and implications. As she brushed her teeth, she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror again. But this time, she didn't see an elderly woman relegated to a guest suite, excluded from family events, and dismissed by her son-in-law. She saw Eleanor Wilson, former CEO and strategist, the woman who'd built an empire alongside her beloved Thomas. The woman who'd outmaneuvered some of the sharpest business minds in Connecticut and earned their respect through competence and determination. Andrew Reynolds might have succeeded in making her feel invisible, irrelevant, and powerless, but he'd made a crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that Eleanor Wilson was just another trusting widow, too naive to understand complex financial matters, too grateful for his family's acceptance to ask difficult questions. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. As Eleanor settled into bed, one phrase from Andrew's phone conversation echoed in her mind, "What they don't know won't hurt them." But Eleanor Wilson knew something now. And tomorrow she would begin to find out just how much damage that knowledge could do to a man who'd built his success on other people's trust and ignorance. The last thing she remembered before drifting off to sleep was Thomas's voice from years ago during one of their late-night strategy sessions at the kitchen table. "Ellie, the most dangerous opponent is the one who looks defeated but isn't actually down for the count. They'll let you get comfortable, let you make mistakes, and then they'll strike when you least expect it." Andrew had certainly made her look defeated, but Eleanor Wilson was far from down for the count. And tomorrow, the real game would begin. The morning light filtered through Eleanor's bedroom curtains with the soft persistence of autumn sunshine, but she had been awake since 5:30, her mind churning over the previous night's discoveries. The laptop sat closed on her small dining table, like a sleeping beast, harboring secrets that could change everything she thought she knew about her family. Eleanor made her morning coffee with the same deliberate care she'd brought to every task for 70 years, but her hands trembled slightly as she measured the grounds. It wasn't age that made her fingers unsteady. It was the weight of knowledge she wasn't sure she wanted to carry. Through the thin walls that separated her suite from the main house, she could hear Jessica's morning routine, the shower running the hair dryer, humming the cheerful clatter of breakfast preparation. Normal sounds of a normal life unmarked by any awareness that the foundation might be cracking beneath their feet. Eleanor had always been an early riser, a habit formed during the years when Wilson Construction demanded her attention before dawn and after dusk. Thomas used to joke that she ran on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination, but the truth was simpler. She'd learned that the quiet morning hours were when her mind worked best, when she could see patterns and possibilities that eluded her during the chaos of the business day. This morning, sitting at her small kitchen table, with the laptop beckoning Eleanor, felt that familiar clarity settling over her thoughts. But alongside it came something she hadn't experienced in years, the particular alertness that came with sensing a worthy opponent. She opened the laptop and returned to her research this time, approaching it with the systematic thoroughness that had made Wilson Construction's due diligence legendary in the industry. If Andrew Reynolds was running some kind of scheme, there would be traces. Men like him, smooth, confident, accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, always left traces. Eleanor began with public records, a skill she'd honed during decades of researching potential contractors and business partners. Reynolds Financial had been incorporated 12 years ago, with Andrew listed as vice president and his father Robert as president. The company's reported revenues had grown steadily, but Eleanor's trained eye caught subtle inconsistencies in the filing patterns that reminded her of contractors who'd tried to inflate their qualifications for bigger projects. She cross-referenced the company's client testimonials with obituary records and found an unsettling pattern. Many of the glowing reviews came from people who had died within a year of providing them. Either Reynolds Financial had an unusually high mortality rate among satisfied customers, or someone was fabricating testimonials using the names of deceased clients who couldn't contradict the claims. Eleanor's coffee grew cold as she delved deeper, following digital breadcrumbs with the patience of someone who'd spent decades untangling complex business relationships. She found a Connecticut Better Business Bureau complaint that had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn, but not before being archived on a third-party website. The complainant, a woman named Patricia Hoffman, had accused Reynolds Financial of grossly misrepresenting investment performance and refusing to provide documentation of her account activity. A quick search revealed that Patricia Hoffman had died 6 months after filing the complaint. Natural causes according to her obituary, but the timing made Eleanor's stomach tighten with unease. The sound of voices from the main house interrupted her research. Through her kitchen window, Eleanor could see Jessica and Andrew on the back patio, sharing what appeared to be a tense conversation over coffee. Even from a distance, Eleanor could read her daughter's body language, the way Jessica held her shoulders. When she was upset, the nervous gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear that had persisted since childhood. Eleanor moved closer to the window, staying out of sight behind the curtain. She couldn't hear words, but she could see Andrew's gestures growing more animated, more forceful. When he reached across the small patio table to grab Jessica's wrist, Eleanor's maternal instincts flared with alarm. Jessica pulled her hand away, but not before Eleanor caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. For just a moment before Jessica composed herself, Eleanor saw fear flicker across her daughter's face. Not irritation or frustration, but actual fear. How long had that been happening? How many subtle signs had Eleanor missed while she'd been grieving? Thomas adjusting to widowhood, trying to find her place in a world that seemed to have moved on without her. The conversation on the patio ended abruptly, with Andrew stalking back into the house and Jessica remaining at the table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth on a day that wasn't particularly cold. Eleanor's heart ached for her daughter, but she forced herself to think strategically rather than emotionally. If Andrew was capable of financial fraud, if he was manipulating elderly clients for his own gain, then what else might he be capable of? And if Jessica had begun to see through his facade, how far would Andrew go to maintain control? The questions multiplied like dominoes falling in Eleanor's mind, each one leading to more disturbing possibilities. She returned to the laptop with renewed urgency, no longer simply curious about irregularities, but genuinely worried about what Andrew Reynolds might do to protect his secrets. This time, Eleanor searched for Andrew's name specifically, looking beyond the professional accolades and community involvement to find traces of the man behind the public image. What she discovered made her wish she'd started this investigation months ago. Andrew had been married before Jessica, a detail he'd somehow omitted from his carefully curated personal history. His first wife, Catherine Morrison Reynolds, had died in a car accident 3 years before he met Jessica. The accident report, archived in local news coverage, mentioned that Catherine had been driving alone late at night, apparently upset about personal matters, according to friends who were interviewed. But more disturbing was what Eleanor found in the probate records from Catherine's estate. The woman had inherited a substantial trust fund from her grandmother money that had passed to Andrew after her death. The timing was interesting. Andrew had used Catherine's inheritance to start Reynolds Financial just months after her funeral. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her mind racing with implications she didn't want to contemplate. One dead wife who'd left him wealthy enough to start a business. A current wife who was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. A pattern of elderly clients who praised his services and then conveniently died before they could cause problems. It might all be coincidence. Eleanor had spent enough years in business to know that suspicious patterns didn't always indicate wrongdoing, but her instincts, the same instincts that had helped her identify unreliable contractors and questionable business deals, were screaming warnings. She thought about Thomas, about the countless evenings they'd spent at their kitchen table, reviewing contracts and discussing strategies. "Trust your gut, Ellie," he'd always said. "Numbers can lie, people can deceive, but your instincts have kept us out of more trouble than any lawyer ever could." Her gut was telling her that Andrew Reynolds was dangerous, not just financially irresponsible or ethically flexible, but genuinely dangerous. And Jessica, sweet Jessica, who'd always seen the best in people, was living with him, depending on him, possibly beginning to fear him. Eleanor made her decision with the same quiet certainty that had characterized every major choice of her life. She would investigate Andrew Reynolds thoroughly, systematically, and carefully. She would gather evidence and documentation that could protect Jessica and potentially other victims. And she would do it all without alerting Andrew to her suspicions until she was ready to act. But first, she needed help. Eleanor had learned long ago that the most successful battles were won by teams, not individuals. Wilson Construction had thrived because she and Thomas had complemented each other's strengths and covered each other's weaknesses. Eleanor opened her phone contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 2 years. George Thompson, Thomas's former business partner, and one of the few people who truly understood what Eleanor was capable of when she set her mind to something. George had retired to Florida after Thomas's death, selling his share of the company and moving to a golf community where he spent his days perfecting his swing and his evenings playing bridge with other successful retirees. But Eleanor knew that beneath the leisure activities, George's mind remained as sharp as ever. More importantly, he'd never forgotten that Eleanor Wilson was the strategic genius behind Wilson Construction's success. She hesitated before dialing, aware that this call would mark the point of no return. Once she involved George, once she began treating Andrew as a serious threat, rather than an irritating son-in-law, she would be committed to seeing this through to whatever conclusion the evidence revealed. Through the window, Eleanor could see Jessica still sitting on the patio, staring into her coffee cup with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Her daughter's unhappiness was written in every line of her posture, in the way she kept glancing nervously at the house, as if expecting Andrew to reappear. Eleanor thought about all the signs she'd ignored or rationalized over the past 2 years. Andrew's insistence on managing every aspect of their social calendar, his subtle criticism of Jessica's friends and interests, his way of making Eleanor feel unwelcome in her own former home while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. She'd attributed it all to personality differences, to the natural adjustment period that came with blended families. She'd told herself that Andrew's background was simply different from theirs, that his formal manner and emphasis on appearances were learned behaviors from a privileged upbringing, not calculated manipulation. But now, with the evidence of potential fraud spreading across her laptop screen and the memory of fear in Jessica's eyes, Eleanor could see the pattern clearly. Andrew Reynolds was a predator, skilled at identifying vulnerable targets and gradually isolating them from their support systems. Eleanor had been vulnerable after Thomas's death, grieving and uncertain about her role in a world that seemed to value her less, without her husband by her side. Jessica had been vulnerable, too lonely after her father's death, and eager for the security that Andrew's confident presence seemed to offer. They'd both been perfect marks for a man who specialized in exploiting women's trust and dependence. But Andrew had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that Eleanor Wilson was just another elderly widow diminished by loss and ready to be managed. He'd never bothered to investigate the woman who'd helped build Wilson Construction into a regional powerhouse, who'd negotiated million-dollar deals and outmaneuvered some of the sharpest business minds in Connecticut. Eleanor pressed George's number before she could second-guess herself. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, warm, with genuine pleasure at hearing from her. "Eleanor Wilson, what a wonderful surprise. How are you, my dear?" "I'm well, George, but I need your help with something. Something serious." The tone in her voice must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because George's manner immediately became more focused. "What's going on, Ellie? You sound worried." Eleanor took a deep breath, aware that her next words would change everything. "I think my son-in-law might be running a financial fraud scheme, and I think my daughter might be in danger." The silence that followed was brief but significant. When George spoke again, his voice carried the weight of their shared history, the understanding that came from decades of partnership and mutual respect. "Tell me everything," he said simply. "And then tell me what you need me to do." As Eleanor began to recount her discoveries, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the particular satisfaction that came from having a worthy challenge and the resources to meet it. Andrew Reynolds might have more formal education, more social connections, and more apparent respectability. But Eleanor Wilson had something he couldn't buy or fake: 4 decades of experience in recognizing threats and neutralizing them before they could cause damage. The game was about to begin, and Andrew had no idea that his opponent had just entered the field. Through the window, Eleanor watched Jessica finally stand and walk back toward the house, her movements careful and controlled. Soon, Eleanor thought her daughter would understand that she wasn't alone in this fight. that the mother Andrew had dismissed as irrelevant was actually the most dangerous enemy he'd ever faced. Eleanor Wilson was done being invisible. It was time to remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with. George Thompson arrived in Maplewood on a crisp Thursday morning, exactly 72 hours after Eleanor's phone call. She watched from her kitchen window as he climbed out of his rental car, still tall and imposing at 75, his shock of white hair catching the autumn sunlight like a beacon of hope. Even in retirement, George carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades making million-dollar decisions and living with the consequences. Eleanor had forgotten how much she'd missed having an intellectual equal to strategize with. Thomas had been her perfect partner, but George had always been their tactical mastermind, the one who could see 3 moves ahead in any negotiation. If anyone could help her navigate the treacherous waters, she discovered it was George Thompson. They met at Green Street Cafe, the same corner booth where Eleanor had shared countless conversations with Martha over the years. But this morning felt different, charged with purpose, and weighted with secrets that could destroy lives or save them. "You look tired, Ellie," George observed after they'd ordered coffee, his keen blue eyes studying her face with the attention to detail that had made him such a formidable business partner. "How long since you've been sleeping properly?" "Since I realized I might be living next to a sociopath," Eleanor replied quietly, surprised by her own bluntness. "George, I think this is bigger than financial fraud. I think Andrew might be dangerous." She'd spent the previous 3 days compiling everything she'd discovered, organizing it with the same methodical approach she'd once brought to construction bids and contractor evaluations. Now she opened her laptop and walked George through her findings, watching his expression grow increasingly grave as the scope of Andrew's deceptions became clear. "Jesus, Ellie," George muttered when she showed him the pattern of deceased clients, whose testimonials still appeared on Reynolds Financial's website. "This isn't just cutting corners or aggressive sales tactics. This is systematic predation." Eleanor had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by someone whose judgment she trusted absolutely made her stomach clench with fear for Jessica. "The question is, what do we do about it? I can't go to the police with circumstantial evidence and suspicions, and I can't confront Andrew directly without putting Jessica at risk." George leaned back in the booth, his fingers steepled in the gesture Eleanor remembered from countless strategy sessions. "First, we need better intelligence. Real documentation, not just patterns and coincidences. Second, we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. And third, we need to find out exactly how much danger Jessica is in." "I've been thinking the same thing," Eleanor admitted, "but I'm not sure how to get access to the kind of information we'd need. It's not like researching contractors. This is securities fraud, potentially money laundering. I'm out of my depth." George smiled, and for a moment, Eleanor saw the shrewd businessman who'd helped build Wilson Construction into a regional powerhouse. "Ellie, you're never out of your depth. You just need to remember what you're capable of." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I still have friends in interesting places. People who owe me favors, who remember when George Thompson's word was worth its weight in gold." Over the next 2 hours, George made a series of calls that reminded Eleanor why he'd been such a valuable partner. He spoke with a retired FBI agent who now worked in corporate security, a forensic accountant who specialized in white-collar crime, and a private investigator who'd helped them uncover bid-rigging schemes in the construction industry years ago. By lunch, they had a plan. "The key," George explained as they walked back to his rental car, "is that we're not trying to build a criminal case. We're gathering information to protect Jessica and potentially other victims. That gives us more flexibility in our methods." Eleanor felt a familiar thrill at having a clear strategy to execute. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like herself again, not the diminished widow Andrew saw, but Eleanor Wilson, the woman who'd outmaneuvered some of the most ruthless businessmen in Connecticut. That afternoon, while Jessica was at her part-time job at the local art gallery and Andrew was presumably at his office, Eleanor put the first phase of their plan into action. She'd spent decades learning to read people to identify their weaknesses and motivations, and now she turned those skills toward understanding her enemy. George had given her the contact information for Sarah Chin, the forensic accountant, who'd agreed to review Reynolds Financial's public filings and identify potential red flags. But Eleanor's role was more personal. She needed to get inside Andrew's world to understand how he operated and where he might be vulnerable. She started with what she knew best: research and relationship building. Eleanor had always been gifted at making people comfortable, at drawing out information through careful conversation and genuine interest. Now, she turned those skills toward Andrew's professional network. Her first stop was the Maplewood Chamber of Commerce, where Andrew served on the board of directors. Eleanor had been a member for decades back when Wilson Construction was a major local employer, and she still knew many of the staff and longtime members. "Eleanor Wilson," exclaimed Patricia Martinez, the chamber's executive director, when Eleanor walked into the office. "It's been too long. How are you adjusting to retirement?" Eleanor smiled, settling into the familiar rhythm of networking conversation. "Oh, you know how it is. Trying to stay busy, stay connected. Actually, I've been thinking about getting more involved again. Jessica's husband, Andrew, speaks so highly of the chamber's work." Patricia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening around her eyes that Eleanor's trained instincts caught immediately. "Andrew Reynolds, yes. He's certainly energetic in his approach to board service." The pause before energetic told Eleanor everything she needed to know. There were problems with Andrew's behavior, even here in the respectable business community, where he projected his most polished image. "I hope he's not too demanding," Eleanor said with the conspiratorial tone of someone seeking gossip. "Jessica mentions that he can be quite particular about things being done exactly right." Patricia glanced around the office, ensuring they weren't overheard, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, Eleanor, there have been some concerns about conflicts of interest. Andrew's been very aggressive about steering chamber business toward companies that happen to be Reynolds' financial clients. It's not necessarily improper, but it's made some people uncomfortable." Eleanor filed this information away while maintaining her expression of mild concern. "Oh dear, I hope it doesn't cause problems for the chamber." "Well," Patricia said carefully, "the board will be discussing some new ethics guidelines at the next meeting. Sometimes people need clearer boundaries about what's appropriate." Eleanor left the chamber office with her first concrete evidence of Andrew's willingness to blur ethical lines for personal gain. It wasn't securities fraud, but it showed a pattern of using his position and relationships for financial advantage, exactly the kind of behavior that could escalate into more serious crimes. Her next stop was more delicate. Eleanor drove to the Connecticut Better Business Bureau office in Hartford, where she'd made an appointment to speak with someone about concerns regarding financial services in her community. She'd learned long ago that the right approach could open doors that seemed permanently closed. James Morrison, the BBB's complaint resolution manager, was a man in his 50s who clearly took his responsibilities seriously. When Eleanor explained that she was researching financial advisors for estate planning purposes and had heard mixed things about Reynolds Financial, his professional demeanor became more focused. "I can't discuss specific complaints," Morrison said carefully, "but I can tell you that we've received several inquiries about Reynolds Financial over the past 2 years. Most were resolved informally, but there have been concerns about documentation and transparency." Eleanor nodded as if this information was helpful, but not surprising. "I see. And would those concerns be the kind that might affect elderly clients particularly?" Morrison's pause was telling. Mrs. Wilson, elderly clients can be particularly vulnerable to certain sales practices, high-pressure tactics, promises that seem too good to be true, reluctance to provide detailed documentation. These are all red flags that we encourage consumers to watch for. What about complaints that are filed and then withdrawn? Eleanor asked carefully. I've heard that sometimes happens when people are pressured or intimidated. Morrison's expression became guarded. That's not uncommon in certain types of disputes. Sometimes complainants receive resolution outside our process. Sometimes they decide the complaint isn't worth pursuing. Unfortunately, sometimes they're convinced to withdraw complaints through less appropriate means. Eleanor left the BBB office with confirmation that Reynolds Financial had a pattern of complaints and irregularities, even if the specifics remained protected by confidentiality rules. But more importantly, she'd established a contact who might be willing to share more information if she could provide evidence of serious wrongdoing. That evening, Eleanor sat in her small living room reviewing her notes and feeling the familiar satisfaction of a successful reconnaissance mission. She'd identified weaknesses in Andrew's professional facade, confirmed that others had concerns about his business practices, and established potential sources for more detailed information. But the real breakthrough came when George called with news from his forensic accountant contact. Sarah Chin is very good at her job, George reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's found irregularities in Reynolds Financial's filings that strongly suggest they're operating a Ponzi scheme. Client funds aren't being invested as promised. They're being used to pay returns to existing clients, while the principals skim management fees and administrative costs. Eleanor felt her worst fears crystallizing into reality. How much money are we talking about? Potentially millions. Sarah thinks they've been running this scheme for at least 3 years, maybe longer. The pattern is classic target elderly clients with limited financial sophistication, promise consistent high returns, regardless of market conditions, use new client funds to pay existing clients, while gradually increasing the money diverted to personal use. Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking about Margaret Winters and the other elderly neighbors who'd entrusted their life savings to Andrew's care. George, we can't just document this and walk away. These people are going to lose everything. I know, George said quietly. Sarah thinks the scheme is probably close to collapse anyway. The mathematics are unsustainable. Eventually, they won't be able to recruit enough new clients to cover the promised returns. When that happens, everyone loses their money except the people who've been skimming off the top. Eleanor felt the familiar burn of righteous anger that had fueled her through decades of fighting unscrupulous contractors and dishonest business partners. But this time the stakes were personal as well as professional. Her daughter was married to a man who was systematically defrauding vulnerable elderly people, and Jessica either didn't know or was too frightened to act. What's our next step? Eleanor asked, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Sarah's working on getting access to more detailed financial records. There are ways to do that legally if you know who to ask and how to ask them. Meanwhile, I think it's time we started looking at Andrew's personal life more closely. If he's stealing millions from client accounts, that money is going somewhere. Eleanor had been thinking the same thing. I've been wondering about their lifestyle, the house renovations, the expensive cars, the country club membership. It all seemed like more than a financial advisor should be able to afford, even a successful one. Exactly. Tomorrow we start following the money trail. Real estate records, vehicle registrations, credit reports. If Andrew's living beyond his legitimate means, we'll find the evidence. After hanging up with George, Eleanor sat in the growing darkness of her small apartment, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Andrew wasn't just a difficult son-in-law or even a garden-variety white-collar criminal. He was systematically destroying the financial security of elderly people who trusted him, stealing their life savings to fund a lifestyle of luxury and respectability. And he was doing it all while living in the house that Eleanor and Thomas had built with their own hands, married to the daughter they'd raised to value honesty and compassion above material success. Eleanor thought about Jessica probably lying in bed next to the man who was capable of such calculated cruelty, unaware that her husband viewed vulnerable elderly people as nothing more than revenue sources to be exploited. How long before Andrew decided that Jessica knew too much or posed too much of a threat to his operation? The thought sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the October night. She'd already seen fear in Jessica's eyes. If Andrew was capable of systematically defrauding dozens of elderly clients, what else might he be capable of when his survival was threatened? Eleanor made herself a cup of tea and returned to her laptop, determined to learn everything she could about the man who'd married her daughter. This time she approached her research with the cold focus of someone whose family was under threat. She started with property records cross-referencing Andrew's name with real estate transactions over the past 5 years. What she found made her blood run cold. Andrew owned 3 properties besides the house he shared with Jessica: a luxury condo in Hartford, a vacation home in the Berkshires, and a commercial property in New Haven that he rented to other businesses. The total value of Andrew's real estate holdings exceeded $2 million, far more than a financial advisor should be able to afford even with legitimate success. And according to the mortgage records, most of these properties had been purchased with cash or minimal financing, suggesting access to large amounts of liquid assets. Eleanor dug deeper using public records and online databases to trace Andrew's spending patterns. Luxury car registrations, expensive jewelry purchases, membership in exclusive clubs and resorts. The evidence painted a picture of a man living far beyond any reasonable income from legitimate financial advisory services. But the most disturbing discovery came when Eleanor searched for information about Andrew's first wife, Catherine Morrison Reynolds. What she found in the archived newspaper coverage of Catherine's fatal car accident made her hands shake with a combination of rage and fear. According to the articles, Catherine had been driving to her lawyer's office on the night she died. She'd recently discovered financial irregularities in her trust fund, which Andrew had been managing since their marriage. Friends quoted in the articles mentioned that Catherine had been very upset about money matters and had planned to take legal action to protect her inheritance. Catherine Morrison Reynolds had died in a single car accident on a rain-slicked road just hours before her scheduled appointment with an attorney who specialized in financial fraud cases. The investigating officers had ruled it an accident, noting that Catherine had been driving too fast for conditions and had apparently lost control on a dangerous curve. But Eleanor's business instincts, sharpened by decades of identifying threats and protecting assets, saw a different pattern. Catherine had discovered Andrew's financial misconduct and was taking steps to expose him. Before she could reach her lawyer, she was dead, and Andrew inherited everything she'd been trying to protect. Now Andrew was married to another woman with access to another family's assets and another victim who might eventually discover his true nature. The parallel was terrifying in its implications. Eleanor closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the main house where Jessica slept beside a man who might be capable of murder. The comfortable illusion of safety that had sustained Eleanor through 2 years of feeling displaced and unwelcome was gone, replaced by the stark understanding that her daughter was in genuine danger. But Eleanor Wilson had faced down threats before, had protected what mattered to her through determination and strategic thinking. Andrew Reynolds might be dangerous, but he'd made the mistake of underestimating his opponent. Tomorrow, Eleanor would begin building the case that would destroy Andrew before he could harm Jessica or any other innocent victim. She would use every skill she'd developed over 4 decades in business, every contact she'd cultivated, every lesson she'd learned about fighting and winning against seemingly superior opponents. Andrew had chosen his victims carefully, targeting elderly widows who seemed powerless and isolated. But Eleanor Wilson was neither powerless nor isolated. She was a strategist with resources, a mother protecting her child, and a woman who'd spent her entire adult life proving that appearances could be fatally deceiving. The real war was about to begin, and Andrew Reynolds had no idea that he'd just made the most dangerous enemy of his life. The law offices of Chin and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Hartford, with views that stretched across the Connecticut River Valley. Eleanor sat in the conference room at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, surrounded by documents that painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise more sophisticated than anything she'd imagined. Sarah Chin, the forensic accountant George had recommended, was a woman in her early 40s with the quiet intensity of someone who'd built her career unraveling financial crimes. She'd spent the past week dissecting Reynolds' financials operations with surgical precision, and her findings were damning beyond Eleanor's worst fears. "What we're looking at here," Sarah explained, spreading bank statements and investment records across the mahogany table, "isn't just a simple Ponzi scheme. This is a multi-layered criminal operation that involves securities fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and potentially racketeering." George, sitting beside Eleanor with his reading glasses perched on his nose, whistled low under his breath. "Jesus, Sarah, how long have they been running this?" "At least 5 years, possibly longer," Sarah replied, pointing to a timeline she'd constructed on her laptop. "The pattern starts small, a few clients here and there, modest discrepancies that could be explained as accounting errors. But it scales up dramatically after Andrew's first wife died, and he inherited her trust fund." Eleanor felt the familiar chill at the mention of Catherine Reynolds. So her money was the seed capital for expanding the fraud. Exactly. Andrew used Catherine's inheritance to create the appearance of successful investment returns for early clients, which allowed him to attract larger investors and more capital. It's textbook Ponzi methodology, but executed with unusual sophistication. Sarah pulled up a complex chart showing money flows between dozens of accounts. They've created a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that makes it extremely difficult to trace where client funds actually go. Money comes in through Reynolds. Financial gets distributed through various business entities and eventually ends up in personal accounts controlled by Andrew and his father, Robert. Eleanor studied the chart, her business experience helping her follow the labyrinthine financial structure. This isn't something Andrew could have designed himself. He's smart, but this level of complexity requires expertise in international banking and securities law. "That's where it gets really interesting," Sarah said, her expression growing more serious. "I've identified at least 3 other financial advisory firms in New England that show similar patterns of suspicious activity. All of them have connections to a consulting company called Apex Financial Services, which appears to specialize in helping investment firms optimize their client management and reporting systems." George leaned forward, his strategic mind already working through the implications. "You're saying there's a whole network of these operations, that someone is teaching people how to set up sophisticated fraud schemes?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. Apex Financial Services is run by a man named Vincent Torino, who has connections to organized crime families in Boston and New York. We're not just dealing with a local financial advisor who got greedy, we're dealing with a criminal organization that operates across multiple states." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full scope of the threat became clear. If Andrew is connected to organized crime, if he's part of some larger criminal network, She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah nodded grimly. Your daughter is married to someone who's essentially a member of a criminal enterprise. And if that organization feels threatened by exposure, they have resources and methods that go far beyond what we'd expect from ordinary white-collar criminals. The conference room fell silent as the three of them processed this information. Eleanor had entered this investigation expecting to find evidence of financial misconduct that could be handled through legal channels. Instead, she'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy that put Jessica in mortal danger. What do we do? Eleanor asked finally, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. We can't go to local police with this. It's too big, too complex, and we can't confront Andrew directly without risking Jessica's safety. George had been quietly thinking, his fingers steepled in the gesture Eleanor recognized from countless strategic planning sessions. We need federal law enforcement, he said finally. FBI, probably the white-collar crime division. This kind of interstate financial crime is exactly what they're equipped to handle. Sarah nodded agreement. I have contacts at the Bureau who specialize in organized financial crime. The evidence we've compiled would definitely be enough to trigger a federal investigation, but, she paused, looking directly at Eleanor. You need to understand that once we involve the FBI, this becomes their operation. You won't have control over the timeline or the methods they use. Eleanor considered this carefully. For 70 years, she'd been accustomed to controlling her own destiny, making her own decisions about how to handle threats and challenges. The idea of turning this over to federal agents who might have different priorities was unsettling. But Jessica's safety outweighed Eleanor's need for control. What about protecting Jessica while an investigation proceeds? Eleanor asked. If the FBI starts looking into Reynolds' financial, won't that tip off Andrew that someone knows about his activities? Federal investigations can take months or even years, Sarah explained. They'll start with financial analysis and surveillance, building an airtight case before making any moves that might alert the targets. Jessica should be safe as long as Andrew doesn't know he's under investigation. Eleanor wasn't entirely reassured. She'd spent decades in business learning that the unexpected could derail even the most careful plans. If Andrew was as dangerous as the evidence suggested, waiting months for federal investigators to build their case might be too risky. I want to meet with your FBI contact, Eleanor decided. I need to understand exactly how they plan to handle this and what safeguards they'll put in place to protect Jessica. Sarah checked her phone. I can set up a meeting for Monday morning. Agent Michael Harrison runs the Financial Crimes Unit here in Connecticut. He's good at his job and he understands the complexities of family situations in these cases. After Sarah left to make arrangements, Eleanor and George remained in the conference room, both lost in thought as they contemplated the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Ellie, George said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. How far are you willing to go to protect Jessica? Eleanor understood the real question he was asking. You think the FBI might not be enough. You think we might need to take matters into our own hands. I think, George said carefully, that we need to have contingency plans. The federal government moves slowly and criminal organizations don't. If Andrew starts to feel threatened, if he decides that Jessica knows too much or poses too great a risk, Eleanor finished the thought that George couldn't bring himself to voice. He might decide to solve the problem the same way he solved it with Catherine. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling between them like a physical presence. Eleanor thought about Jessica, probably at the art gallery right now, chatting with customers and arranging displays, blissfully unaware that her husband was capable of murder. George, Eleanor said quietly, I need to ask you something too. When we were building Wilson Construction, when we were fighting off competitors and dealing with threats to the business, you sometimes had to handle situations that weren't entirely conventional. George's expression became carefully neutral. I did what was necessary to protect our interests and our people. Do you still have contacts who could help with unconventional solutions? People who understand that sometimes legal channels aren't sufficient to protect innocent people from dangerous criminals. George was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the conference table. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience and difficult choices. Ellie, what you're asking about, that's a path you can't come back from. Once you cross certain lines, once you operate outside the law, even for the best of reasons, you become something different than what you were before. Eleanor nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was contemplating. I know, but if it comes down to Jessica's life versus my comfort with moral ambiguity, there's no choice to make. Then yes, George said simply. I still have contacts, people who specialize in problems that can't be solved through official channels. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Eleanor left the law offices with her mind churning through possibilities and contingencies. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave her time to process the emotional weight of what she'd learned. Jessica wasn't just married to a white-collar criminal. She was married to someone connected to a network of dangerous people who solved problems through violence and intimidation. But Eleanor had also learned something about herself during the morning's revelations. She was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect her daughter, even if it meant crossing moral and legal boundaries she'd never imagined approaching. The drive back to Maplewood took 45 minutes through autumn landscapes that should have been beautiful but seemed ominous under the weight of what Eleanor now knew. Every normal scene, families raking leaves, children playing in yards, elderly couples walking dogs, felt like a facade hiding darker realities. By the time Eleanor reached home, she'd made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would cooperate with the FBI investigation and follow all legal channels for as long as they seemed effective. But she would also prepare alternative options, backup plans that didn't depend on the slow machinery of federal law enforcement. Eleanor Wilson had spent her entire adult life protecting what mattered to her through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. Now those same qualities would be tested against an enemy more dangerous than any she'd faced before. But she had advantages that Andrew couldn't know about. She had George's network of contacts, Sarah's expertise in financial crimes, and most importantly, she had the element of surprise. Andrew still saw her as a powerless elderly widow, irrelevant to his operations and incapable of threatening his carefully constructed empire. That fatal underestimation would be his downfall. Eleanor parked her car and walked toward her small apartment, already planning the next phase of her campaign. She would meet with the FBI on Monday and provide them with everything Sarah had uncovered, but she would also begin preparing for the possibility that legal methods might not be sufficient to protect Jessica from a man who'd already killed once to protect his secrets. As she reached her door, Eleanor paused to look back at the main house where Jessica lived with a monster who wore the mask of a respectable financial advisor. Soon, Eleanor promised silently her daughter would understand that she wasn't alone in this fight. The real battle was just beginning, and Eleanor Wilson intended to win at any cost. The FBI field office in New Haven occupied a modern building that projected federal authority through clean lines and intimidating security measures. Eleanor sat in Agent Michael Harrison's office on Monday morning, surrounded by case files and evidence charts that transformed her family crisis into an official law enforcement matter. Agent Harrison was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 50, with graying temples and the focused intensity of someone who'd built his career prosecuting complex financial crimes. He'd spent the past hour reviewing Sarah Chin's analysis with the thoroughness of an expert who understood both the legal and practical implications of what they'd uncovered. "Mrs. Wilson," Harrison said, finally setting down the last of the financial reports, "what you've brought us represents one of the most sophisticated multi-state financial fraud operations we've seen in recent years. This goes far beyond a local investment advisor cutting corners. We're looking at a criminal organization with interstate operations and probable connections to organized crime." Eleanor had steeled herself for this confirmation, but hearing it from a federal agent made the danger feel more real and immediate. "What does that mean for my daughter's safety? How long before Andrew realizes he's under investigation?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully professional. Federal investigations of this complexity typically take 12 to 18 months to develop fully. We start with financial analysis and surveillance building evidence that will support federal charges. Your son-in-law shouldn't have any indication that he's under investigation unless he has law enforcement contacts who might tip him off. And if he does have those contacts, Eleanor pressed, if someone warns him that the FBI is looking into his operation? Harrison's pause was telling. That's always a risk in cases involving organized crime. These networks often include corrupt officials, people who provide early warnings about law enforcement activity. We'll be careful, but we can't guarantee that our investigation will remain secret indefinitely. Eleanor felt a familiar frustration with bureaucratic limitations. "Agent Harrison, with respect, my daughter is living with a man who may have killed his first wife to protect his criminal operation. 18 months is too long to wait for justice when Jessica could be in immediate danger." "I understand your concerns," Harrison replied, "but building a case that will actually convict these people requires patience and methodical investigation. If we move too quickly, if we alert them before we have overwhelming evidence, they'll destroy records, flee the jurisdiction, or worse, eliminate witnesses who could testify against them." George, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, leaned forward. "Agent Harrison, what would it take to get Jessica immediate protection, some kind of witness protection, or safe house arrangement?" Harrison shook his head. "She's not officially a witness to anything yet, and we don't have evidence of a specific immediate threat to her safety. The Bureau can't provide protection based on speculation about what might happen." Eleanor felt the cold certainty settling in her mind that legal channels, however well-intentioned, would not be sufficient to protect Jessica from the dangers she faced. The FBI would eventually build their case and arrest Andrew, but probably not before he realized his operation was compromised and took steps to eliminate potential threats, including his wife. What if Jessica discovered evidence of Andrew's crimes on her own? Eleanor asked carefully. If she found documents or overheard conversations that made her a legitimate witness to federal crimes? Harrison's expression sharpened with interest. That would change things significantly. If she had direct knowledge of criminal activity and was willing to cooperate with our investigation, we could justify immediate protective measures. Eleanor exchanged a meaningful glance with George. And how might someone in Jessica's position go about safely documenting evidence without alerting her husband to what she was doing? Harrison studied Eleanor with the attention of someone reassessing an initial impression. "Mrs. Wilson, I need to be very clear about something. We cannot and will not ask you to place your daughter in danger by encouraging her to spy on her husband. If Andrew Reynolds is as dangerous as the evidence suggests, any attempt by Jessica to gather evidence could put her life at risk." "I understand," Eleanor replied. "I'm simply asking what someone in her position should do if they accidentally discovered evidence of criminal activity." Harrison reached into his desk drawer and extracted a business card and a small electronic device that looked like a thumb drive. If someone were to accidentally discover evidence, he said carefully, they should contact the FBI immediately using the number on this card. And if they found themselves in a position where they needed to document evidence for their own safety, this device can record audio and video without being detected by casual observation. Eleanor pocketed both items, understanding that Harrison was walking a careful line between official procedure and practical reality. He couldn't officially encourage Jessica to spy on Andrew, but he could provide tools that might save her life if the situation deteriorated. After leaving the FBI office, Eleanor and George drove in silence through New Haven traffic, both processing the implications of what they'd learned. The federal investigation would proceed but slowly, and with no guarantee that Jessica would remain safe while evidence was being gathered. "We need to accelerate our own timeline," Eleanor said finally as they reached the highway back to Maplewood. "The FBI isn't wrong. Building a legal case takes time, but we can't wait 18 months for them to arrest Andrew." George nodded grimly. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor had been developing a plan during the meeting with Agent Harrison, refining it as she understood the limitations of official law enforcement. "We need to force Andrew into a position where he reveals his true nature to Jessica, where she sees him clearly enough to leave him voluntarily. But we need to do it in a way that doesn't trigger his survival instincts until she's safely away from him." "That's a dangerous game, Ellie. If Andrew suspects that Jessica knows about his operation, he might decide she's too great a risk to leave alive." Eleanor felt the cold determination that had sustained her through decades of business battles. "Then we make sure she has protection that doesn't depend on federal bureaucracy. George, remember when we were dealing with those contractors who were skimming materials from our job sites? You said you had contacts who could handle problems that weren't suitable for official channels." George was quiet for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he navigated traffic and difficult memories. "Ellie, what you're talking about, it's not just crossing legal lines, it's entering a world where violence is a standard business practice." "And Andrew is already in that world," Eleanor pointed out. "He's connected to organized crime, he's probably murdered his first wife, and he's systematically defrauding elderly people who trusted him with their life savings. I'm not suggesting we become criminals, I'm suggesting we level the playing field." George glanced at her, and Eleanor saw recognition in his eyes. He understood that she'd moved beyond conventional morality into the realm of protecting family by any means necessary. "There's a man named Marcus Webb," George said finally. "Former military, now runs a private security company that handles discrete problems for people who can't rely on official protection. He's expensive, but he's also completely reliable and surprisingly ethical within his chosen profession." "What kind of services does he provide?" "Surveillance, protection, intelligence gathering. And if necessary, he can make problems disappear in ways that don't leave traces for law enforcement to follow." Eleanor nodded, understanding the implication. "Can you contact him?" "I can arrange a meeting, but Ellie, once we involve someone like Marcus Webb, we're committed to a path that the federal government won't approve of. If this goes wrong, if anyone gets hurt, we'll be legally responsible for whatever happens." Eleanor thought about Jessica probably at home right now, preparing dinner for a husband who might be planning her death. The abstract legal concerns that worried George seemed less important than the immediate reality of protecting her daughter from a genuine monster. "Set up the meeting," Eleanor decided. "I need to understand all our options before I make final decisions about how to proceed." That evening, Eleanor sat in her small living room with her laptop open, reviewing everything they'd learned and planning the next phase of her campaign. The FBI investigation would proceed according to federal protocols, but Eleanor would not depend entirely on official law enforcement to protect Jessica. She'd spent decades in business learning that the most successful strategies involved multiple approaches to the same objective. If one method failed, you had alternatives already in place. If legal channels proved insufficient, she would explore other options. Eleanor picked up her phone and called Jessica's number. Her daughter answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the artificial brightness that Eleanor had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Hi, Mom. How was your day?" "Lovely, sweetheart. I was wondering if you'd like to have lunch tomorrow, just the two of us. It's been too long since we had a real conversation." There was a pause before Jessica responded. "That sounds wonderful. Andrew has meetings all afternoon, so we could have plenty of time to talk." Eleanor heard something in her daughter's voice, relief perhaps, or hunger for the kind of honest conversation that had apparently become rare in Jessica's life with Andrew. "Perfect. Green Street Cafe at noon. I'll be there, Mom. And Mom, thank you for thinking of me." After hanging up, Eleanor sat quietly in the gathering darkness, planning tomorrow's conversation with Jessica. She couldn't reveal the full scope of what she'd discovered without potentially putting Jessica in immediate danger, but she could begin the delicate process of opening her daughter's eyes to the man she'd married. Eleanor thought about Thomas, about the countless evenings they'd spent strategizing and planning for challenges that seemed insurmountable. "Trust your instincts, Ellie," he'd always said, "and remember that the most dangerous opponent is often the one who's underestimated you." Andrew Reynolds had definitely underestimated Eleanor Wilson. Tomorrow she would begin the careful process of turning that underestimation into his downfall. The endgame was approaching, and Eleanor intended to win decisively. The Maplewood Country Club's annual Harvest Gala was the social event of the season, drawing the town's most prominent families for an evening of charity fundraising and carefully orchestrated networking. Eleanor stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the elegant crowd move through their ritual of air kisses and polite conversation, champagne flutes catching the light from crystal chandeliers that had witnessed decades of similar gatherings. She wore her finest black dress, the one Thomas had bought her for their 40th wedding anniversary, along with her grandmother's pearl necklace and the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was about to do. At 70, Eleanor Wilson had never looked more formidable or more purposeful. Across the room, Andrew Reynolds held court near the auction display, his silver hair gleaming under the lights as he charmed a circle of potential clients with his practiced smile and easy laugh. He wore success like a tailored suit, expensive, perfectly fitted and designed to impress people who valued appearances over substance. Jessica stood beside him in a stunning navy gown, but Eleanor could see the tension in her daughter's posture, the way she kept glancing toward the exits as if calculating escape routes. The conversation Eleanor had initiated 3 weeks ago had begun to bear fruit. Jessica was finally seeing cracks in Andrew's carefully maintained facade. "He's been taking calls at all hours," Jessica had confided during their lunch at Green Street Cafe the previous week. "Strange conversations about accounts and transfers. And when I asked about it, he got angry, really angry, Mom. He's never raised his voice to me before." Eleanor had listened carefully, providing comfort while gently asking questions that encouraged Jessica to notice patterns she'd previously overlooked. The process required delicate balance, awakening Jessica's awareness without alarming Andrew to what was happening. Now, watching her daughter's obvious discomfort at her husband's side, Eleanor felt the familiar certainty that came with having a clear objective and the means to achieve it. Tonight would end Andrew's reign of deception permanently. George Thompson approached from the bar, distinguished in his black tuxedo and carrying 2 glasses of wine. At 75, he commanded respect simply by entering a room the bearing of a man who'd built an empire and survived every challenge that came with success. "Everything ready?" he asked quietly, handing Eleanor a glass. Eleanor nodded, checking her small evening purse, where she carried the evidence that would destroy Andrew's carefully constructed life. Agent Harrison confirmed that federal agents are positioned outside. Marcus Webb's people are monitoring all the exits. Once this starts, Andrew won't be able to run or communicate with his criminal associates. The past 3 weeks had been a masterclass in strategic planning. While the FBI continued their methodical investigation, Eleanor had worked with George and Marcus Webb to create a trap that would force Andrew to reveal his true nature in front of witnesses while ensuring Jessica's safety. Marcus Webb had proven to be exactly what George had promised, a former Special Forces operative who now provided discreet security services for people whose problems couldn't be solved through conventional channels. His surveillance of Andrew had revealed additional crimes, money laundering for a Boston crime family, tax evasion on a massive scale, and most disturbing, recent contact with the same problem solver who'd been in Connecticut around the time of Catherine Reynolds' fatal accident. "He's planning something," Marcus had reported during their final strategy meeting. Increased security around his office, multiple encrypted phone calls to people with connections to violence. Whatever timeline he's operating on, it's accelerating. Eleanor had made the decision to force a confrontation before Andrew could implement whatever solution he was planning for the Jessica problem. Tonight's gala provided the perfect opportunity, a public setting filled with witnesses, including many of Andrew's defrauded clients. The auction portion of the evening was beginning with Maplewood's mayor taking the podium to thank the assembled guests for their charitable generosity. Eleanor watched Andrew's face as Margaret Winters, the elderly neighbor whose life savings he'd stolen, bid enthusiastically on a weekend spa package. Andrew's expression revealed nothing, but Eleanor knew from Marcus Webb's financial analysis that Margaret's account had been completely depleted months ago. The statements she received showing healthy returns were complete fiction generated by software designed to maintain client confidence, while Andrew systematically stole everything she owned. Margaret wasn't alone. Eleanor had identified at least a dozen elderly residents of Maplewood who were unwittingly bidding on auction items with money they no longer possessed, their financial security sacrificed to fund Andrew's lifestyle and criminal operations. The time had come. Eleanor walked purposefully toward the podium, her grandmother's pearls catching the light as she moved through the crowd with the dignity of someone who belonged in these rooms by right, rather than invitation. Conversations paused as people recognized Thomas Wilson's widow, the woman who'd helped build half the commercial properties in town. "Excuse me, Mayor Phillips," Eleanor said as she reached the platform. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have an announcement that I believe this community needs to hear." The mayor, clearly flustered by the unexpected interruption, looked uncertain. But Eleanor had known Robert Phillips since he was elected 15 years ago, had contributed to his campaigns, and supported his initiatives. Her request carried weight that couldn't be dismissed. "Of course, Eleanor. Please go ahead." Eleanor accepted the microphone with steady hands, looking out over an audience that included many of Andrew's victims, alongside Maplewood's social elite. She spotted Agent Harrison near the back of the room, his presence a reminder that this moment would have consequences extending far beyond social embarrassment. "Thank you all for your attention." Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. "Many of you knew my late husband Thomas, who spent his life building homes and businesses in this community. Thomas taught me that the foundation of any structure, whether it's a building or a community, depends on trust and integrity." Eleanor paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience until it settled on Andrew, whose confident expression was beginning to show cracks of uncertainty. "Unfortunately, someone in our community has been systematically betraying that trust, stealing from our neighbors and friends while hiding behind a facade of respectability and charitable concern." A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to sense that this wasn't a typical charity gala speech. Eleanor saw Andrew start to move toward the exits, but Marcus Webb's security team was already in position, blocking his escape routes with the subtle efficiency of professionals. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor continued, I discovered evidence that Reynolds Financial has been operating a massive fraud scheme, stealing millions of dollars from elderly clients while providing them with fake statements showing fictional investment returns. The murmur became a buzz of shocked conversation as people turned to look at Andrew, whose face had gone pale beneath his artificial tan. Eleanor saw Jessica's hand fly to her mouth in horror as the reality of her situation finally became undeniable. "Margaret Winters," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom, "your account shows a balance of $347,000 as of last month's statement. The actual balance is zero. Andrew Reynolds has stolen every penny of your late husband's life insurance money." Margaret Winters gripped her husband's arm, her face crumpling with the understanding that her financial security was an illusion. Around the room, other elderly residents began to whisper frantically, comparing notes and realizing the scope of their shared victimization. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "I have bank records, investment statements, and recordings of phone conversations that document the systematic theft of over $4 million from Reynolds Financial clients. But the financial fraud is just the beginning." Andrew finally found his voice pushing through the crowd toward the podium with his practiced charm sliding into desperate aggression. "This is outrageous. Eleanor Wilson is a bitter old woman who's been causing problems for my family ever since. Since you relegated me to sleeping in a garage while you renovated the house my husband built," Eleanor interrupted smoothly. "Since you isolated my daughter from her friends and family. Since you began planning my daughter's death the same way you arranged your first wife's fatal accident." The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps and urgent conversations as Eleanor's accusations hit their target with devastating precision. Andrew's face cycled through expressions of rage, panic, and calculation as he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "You have no proof of any of this," Andrew shouted, his composure finally cracking under the weight of public exposure. "Catherine's death was an accident. The investigation was closed years ago." Eleanor smiled with the cold satisfaction of a chess player announcing checkmate. "Agent Harrison of the FBI might disagree with you about that. Agent Harrison, would you care to join us?" The federal agent moved through the crowd with purposeful authority, his badge visible as he approached the podium. Behind him, Eleanor could see other agents taking positions throughout the ballroom, ensuring that no one connected to Andrew's operation would escape. "Andrew Reynolds," Agent Harrison announced in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent ballroom, "you're under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder." The rest of his Miranda rights were drowned out by the chaos that erupted as Maplewood's social elite realized they were witnessing the destruction of one of their most prominent members. Phones appeared throughout the crowd as people documented Andrew's arrest, his fall from grace becoming social media content in real time. Eleanor watched Andrew's face as the handcuffs clicked into place, seeing the exact moment when his arrogance transformed into the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. This was the man Jessica had been living with, the predator who'd hidden behind charm and respectability while planning her destruction. "Jessica!" Andrew called out as Agent Harrison led him toward the exit, his voice carrying a note of genuine panic for the first time. "Jessica, don't believe her. She's lying about everything. You know me. You know I would never." But Jessica had already turned away, unable to look at the man she'd thought she loved. Eleanor saw her daughter's shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs and moved quickly to provide the support Jessica would need to survive this public revelation. "It's over, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered as she wrapped her arms around Jessica. "You're safe now. He can never hurt you again." Around them, the Harvest Gala continued its transformation from elegant charity event to crime scene, but Eleanor felt only the deep satisfaction of justice finally served. Andrew Reynolds had underestimated the quiet strength of an elderly widow, had dismissed her as irrelevant and powerless. He was about to learn the cost of that fatal miscalculation. 6 months later, Eleanor Wilson stood in the kitchen of her restored home, watching through the window as spring sunlight illuminated the garden where Thomas's roses were beginning their annual bloom. The house felt like itself again, filled with warmth and laughter, echoing with the voices of people who belonged there, rather than the cold precision of someone treating it as a stage set. Jessica was in the garden planting herbs in the raised beds they'd built together over the winter. Eleanor's daughter looked younger somehow, as if the weight of living with Andrew had been pressing her down in ways that only became apparent after it was lifted. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago, with Jessica receiving no assets from Andrew's estate. Everything he'd owned had been seized by federal prosecutors as proceeds from criminal activity. But Jessica didn't need Andrew's ill-gotten wealth. The life insurance policy from Thomas, which Eleanor had quietly maintained and transferred to Jessica's name, would provide financial security. More importantly, Jessica had rediscovered the strength and independence that Andrew had systematically undermined during their marriage. Eleanor's laptop sat open on the kitchen table, displaying the morning's news coverage of Andrew's sentencing hearing. Federal prosecutors had secured convictions on all charges: securities fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of his first wife, Catherine. The judge had imposed a sentence of 35 years in federal prison, ensuring that Andrew would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. The wider criminal organization had fallen like dominoes after Andrew's arrest. Vincent Torino, the organized crime figure who taught Andrew and dozens of other financial advisors how to operate sophisticated fraud schemes, was facing federal charges in 3 states. The consultants who'd helped arrange Catherine Reynolds' death had been arrested and were providing testimony against their former employers in exchange for reduced sentences. Most satisfying to Eleanor, nearly $4 million had been recovered and returned to Andrew's victims. Margaret Winters had her life savings restored, along with compensation for the stress and uncertainty she'd endured. The other elderly residents of Maplewood, who trusted Andrew with their financial security, were once again able to sleep peacefully, knowing their futures were protected. Eleanor's role in exposing the criminal organization had brought her a kind of celebrity she'd never sought. CNN had done a feature story on the 70-year-old widow who brought down a multi-state fraud ring, and she'd received speaking invitations from women's organizations across New England. The AARP had asked her to serve as a spokesperson for their campaign against financial elder abuse. But the recognition that meant the most came from Agent Harrison, who'd visited Eleanor just after Andrew's conviction was announced. "Mrs. Wilson," he'd said, sitting in her living room with the formal dignity that marked all his professional interactions, "I want you to know that your courage and investigative work saved lives. We found evidence that Andrew was planning to eliminate Jessica the same way he'd eliminated Catherine. If you hadn't acted when you did..." He hadn't needed to finish the sentence. Eleanor understood that her decision to investigate Andrew, to gather evidence and force a confrontation, had literally saved her daughter's life. Now, watching Jessica in the garden, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction that came with protecting what mattered most. The past 6 months had been challenging, testifying in federal court, dealing with media attention, helping Jessica process the trauma of learning that her husband was a killer, but they'd emerged stronger and closer than ever. George Thompson had become a regular visitor, joining Eleanor and Jessica for Sunday dinners and strategic discussions about Eleanor's unexpected second career as an advocate for elder abuse victims. At 75, George had found new purpose in helping other families identify and address financial crimes targeting elderly relatives. Marcus Webb had transitioned from security contractor to legitimate private investigator, establishing a business that specialized in background investigations for families concerned about potential financial predators. Eleanor served as an informal consultant teaching other elderly people how to recognize the warning signs of investment fraud and relationship manipulation. The doorbell interrupted Eleanor's morning reflection. Through the front window, she could see a young woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase and looking nervous in the way that suggested she was gathering courage for a difficult conversation. Eleanor opened the door to find a woman in her 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded her of Jessica at that age. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Linda Chin, Sarah's younger sister. My sister said you might be able to help me with a situation involving my mother and her financial advisor." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the pattern she'd become expert at identifying. Another family was discovering that their trusted financial professional might not be what he seemed. Another elderly person was potentially being victimized by someone who specialized in exploiting trust and vulnerability. "Please come in, Linda. Let's talk about what's been happening." As Eleanor led Linda Chin into her living room, she felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had sustained her through 40 years of business challenges and the recent battle to save Jessica. Eleanor Wilson had spent most of her life building and protecting first the construction company with Thomas, then her family's security and happiness. Now, in what many people would consider her retirement years, Eleanor had found a new calling. She would spend whatever time she had left identifying predators like Andrew Reynolds and teaching other families how to protect themselves from sophisticated criminals who hid behind respectable facades. Andrew Reynolds had made a fatal error when he dismissed Eleanor as irrelevant when he assumed that age and widowhood had rendered her powerless. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality that Eleanor Wilson possessed decades of experience in recognizing threats and neutralizing them before they could cause damage. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor that Andrew's attempt to diminish and control her had ultimately led to his own destruction. By underestimating his opponent by failing to recognize the strategic mind beneath the grandmother's exterior, he'd created the conditions for his own downfall. As Eleanor listened to Linda Chin describe the suspicious behavior of her mother's financial advisor, she felt Thomas's presence around her like a warm embrace. Her beloved husband would have been proud of the woman she'd become after his death, not diminished by loss but strengthened by purpose and determined to protect others from the predators who thrived on exploiting vulnerability. Outside in the garden, Jessica was laughing at something she'd discovered among the herbs, probably the first shoots of the lavender they'd planted in memory of Thomas. The sound of her daughter's genuine happiness was the sweetest victory Eleanor could imagine. Eleanor Wilson had given her daughter the family home with love and generosity. Andrew Reynolds had tried to use that gift to isolate and eventually destroy both women, but he'd underestimated the power of a mother's love, the strategic mind of a seasoned businesswoman, and the quiet strength of a woman who'd spent 70 years learning that appearances could be fatally deceiving. The monster was in prison where he belonged. The victims had been restored and protected. The family was whole again, stronger for having survived the test. And Eleanor Wilson, at 70 years old, had discovered that her most important work was just beginning. Justice, she reflected as Linda Chin began to tell her story, was a dish best served with patience, intelligence, and the unwavering determination to protect the innocent from those who would exploit their trust. Andrew Reynolds had learned that lesson too late. Eleanor intended to make sure that other predators learned it before they could destroy any more lives. The war was won, but the battle for justice would continue as long as Eleanor Wilson had breath in her body and fire in her heart. Eleanor Wilson's story reminds us that strength doesn't diminish with age. It deepens, becoming more focused and more determined. At 70 years old, she didn't just save her daughter's life. She dismantled an entire criminal organization and protected countless other families from financial predators who prey on trust and vulnerability. The truth is, women like Eleanor surround us every day. They're the grandmothers who've weathered decades of challenges, the widows who've rebuilt their lives after loss, the mothers who've spent lifetimes protecting their families. Society often overlooks them, dismisses their wisdom, treats them as invisible. But beneath that quiet exterior lies a lifetime of experience, strategic thinking, and the kind of fierce determination that can move mountains. Andrew Reynolds saw an elderly woman sleeping in a garage and assumed she was defeated. He never imagined that Eleanor Wilson was simply gathering intelligence, planning her strategy, and preparing to demonstrate exactly what happens when a predator underestimates his prey. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated because of your age, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. In the comments below, tell us about a time when you had to stand up for yourself or someone you loved. Your story matters, your voice matters, and your strength, no matter your age, can change everything. Remember, the most dangerous opponent is often the one who looks defeated, but isn't actually down for the count. Eleanor Wilson proved that sometimes the quiet strength of an underestimated woman is the most powerful force in the world. Until next time, keep fighting, keep believing in your own power, and never let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. They're not. They're just getting started.